1. Hey everyone, welcome back to the author reading of Dragons of Eisenthal series book 1, Throne of Deceit. This week we're doing chapters 5 and 6, and of course pdmac is here with me. So you already know us, so we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. Chapter 5, Gwen. An hour after departing the cemetery outside Dawsbury, Gwen and Tobias were nearing the outpost that the prisoners had been escorted to. Gwen had spent much of the walk deep in thought. Tobias had thrown so much information at her, and she was still working through it all. When she spotted the outpost, she stopped walking. I thought we were going to see Eredor. We are, Tobias replied. His place is past the outpost. Aren't you afraid the soldiers will see you? Not really. I don't think the men we encountered will remember my face from the many others they've seen today. Besides, it was dark. If any of them happen to memorize what they saw, I'd be impressed. Gwen wrung her hands anxiously, but she reminded herself that she agreed to trust Tobias, and this would be the first opportunity to prove her word. She nodded at him and continued walking. Besides, we're going to need a horse, maybe two. How much do you weigh? That's none of your business, Gwen snapped, and I didn't know the soldiers sold horses at the outpost. They don't, Tobias said. We're going to steal one. I'm sorry? I don't think I heard you correctly. You said we're going to steal a horse from the king's soldiers? Sounds like to me like you've got great hearing. Gwen shot a glare at Tobias, but he was grinning from ear to ear. You must think yourself amusing, she said. Absolutely. Life is too short for delusions. Tobias chuckled at his own joke, but Gwen rolled her eyes. Don't worry, I've done this several times. We'll be long gone before they even know a horse is missing. Trust me. There were far too many warning signs for Gwen's comfort, but she was determined to keep her word. Tobias was proving to be brash and overconfident, but he was the only person Gwen had right now. Tobias took them off the road, keeping a wide berth of the outpost until they passed it, then circled back and hid among the shadows of a copse of trees. Gwen was tempted to ask why he wasted the effort, but then she spotted the stable. It was a squat wood building with a thatched roof outside the main compound. A lantern hung next to each of the stalls, illuminating the area more than Gwen was comfortable with. Stay here and wait for me. Once I'm free of the stable, you'll need to be prepared for a hasty exit. We're going to fly like the wind. What about all that light? Someone is bound to see you moving around. The lanterns are new, but that just makes my job easier, Tobias said. I don't have to fumble around in the dark. What if something goes wrong? What should I do? Gwen looked around for anything that might be used as a weapon, but aside from a few busted wagon wheels, she didn't spot anything useful. If I whistle, that means go. Go where? Gwen asked. Anywhere. Just get away from here. Find somewhere to lie low and wait a day or two, then head to Penshaw and find an elf named Uriel. She'll get you to Eredor. Just get a horse and get back here, Gwen said. Yes, my lady. Tobias offered a mock bow and sprinted to the stable. Gwen watched fretfully until Tobias entered one of the stalls. She looked around to make sure there were no soldiers, but the trees blocked part of her view. She crept closer to the edge of the tree line and stopped when she smelled urine. The scent was strong and burned her nostrils. A few more steps revealed the source of the smell. A makeshift latrine had been dug in front of her. Gwen pinched her nose shut and finished surveying the area. It was quiet, and she didn't see a single soldier, which she found odd. Should someone be on watch or something? She wondered. The door to the stall Tobias had entered opened, its hinges creaking. Gwen flinched, expecting the entire garrison to come pouring out of the outpost. Instead, Tobias led a dappled mare out and then mounted it. He flicked the reins, and the horse took off with a burst of speed. Gwen turned and ran through the trees, breaking free of the copse and ending up on the road. She saw Tobias approaching quickly, but she noticed another horse following him. A black-clad soldier rode on its back and lifted something up. A moment later, there was a whizzing sound, and Tobias let out a cry of anguish. He remained on the horse, and as he neared Gwen, he leaned over the side and stretched out his arm. Gwen jogged toward him and grabbed a hold of his arm, using her momentum and his strength to shoot upward and land on the saddle behind him. She wrapped her arms around him and felt something wet and warm against her arm. Tobias flicked the reins again and rammed his heels into the horse's flanks, urging the beast to go faster. Gwen looked back and saw the mounted soldier wasn't following them. Roughly a mile down the road revealed why, as Tobias grunted and slouched forward, almost falling off the horse. Gwen jerked the reins from him and slowed their pace, giving the horse a reprieve, but also allowing her to look over Tobias. She found a crossbow bolt lodged in his side and an alarming amount of blood soaked into his shirt. Tobias, can you hear me? The man was unconscious. Gwen considered removing the bolt, but she didn't know if that would help or injure him further, so she left it alone. She had seen the results of barroom brawls before, but this was something entirely different. He needed a healer, and there weren't any, and they weren't anywhere near one. Gwen managed to pull Tobias into her lap and got the horse to move faster, but nowhere near the breakneck pace that Tobias had. She assumed they would have to ride through the night before they reached the nearest town, but when she spotted a farmhouse a while later, she whispered a heartfelt thanks to the sky and stopped the horse. Gwen laid Tobias on the horse's neck and slid off the saddle, then ran to the front door of the house and knocked loudly. The door opened and an older man peered out at her. My friend needs help. He's lost a lot of blood and needs a healer. The man looked from her to the horse. Me and Gail ain't healers, but she can stitch him up. Help me bring him inside. He stepped out of the house and shouted over his shoulder, Gail, get out here, woman. Gwen helped the man pull Tobias down from the saddle, and they awkwardly carried him into the house. The man guided Gwen into the kitchen, and they laid Tobias on the table. It creaked under Tobias's weight, but it held firmly. What happened? Gail asked, her voice low and frail. I'd say he was hit by a crossbow, the man said, pointing to the bolt on Tobias's side. Let me get my things. Errol, be a dear and get me a bowl of water and some cloth. The two left the kitchen. Gwen looked at Tobias's still form. The bolt had pierced his right side, just above the hip. His cobalt-hued shirt was dark with blood, and more seeped from the wound, dripping onto the table. Gail returned first, holding a needle and thread. Have you ever tended a wound? She asked. Never, Gwen answered. Some don't have the stomach for it, but when you've lived with animals long enough, you get used to some ugly sights. Errol carried a wooden bowl half filled with water, and a bolt of cloth under his arm. He pulled a chair out from under the table and set the bowl on it, then started unrolling the cloth, cutting it into strips. I'm not one to pry, Errol said as he worked, but what brings you two out to the country at this hour? We were on our way to see a friend, Gwen said, before we were attacked. Errol frowned. The road used to be safe from brigands. Lately, though, he exchanged looks with Gail. Well, lately there have been problems. The soldiers? Gwen boldly asked. Yes, Gail said. They come through our land sometimes, picking from our crops and stealing our chickens. Gail gently pulled Tobias' shirt away from the wound, then examined the bolt. Errol, yeah, Errol muttered. Be a dear and pull the bolt out. I got it, woman. Gwen averted her gaze, unsure she could stomach the gruesome sight. There we go, Errol said, and Gwen looked back at Tobias and immediately regretted it. More blood flowed from the wound. Gail cupped her hands and dipped them into the bowl, then poured the water onto Tobias's damaged flesh. Tobias groaned and his head lolled to the side, but he remained unconscious. Gwen felt faint. All the blood was making her queasy. Errol took notice and motioned for her to follow him. Holler if you need anything, he told Gail. She waved him off, focusing on her work. He led Gwen out of the house and around to the back. He's not fit for travel, so you're going to need to stay somewhere for the night. We don't have rooms in the house, but you can stay in the barn. The nights have been warm, so you shouldn't need a fire, but if you do, keep it away from the walls. Thank you for the offer, but I don't think we should stay here, Gwen said. I know the lodging I'm offering isn't the best, but it's all we have. It's not that. I just don't think it's wise to stay in one place too long right now. Gwen looked in the direction they'd traveled from. The road was empty, but something was telling her to keep moving. Errol nodded wordlessly. I understand. You're free to risk it, but I think your friend is going to need the rest. Jouncing around on a horse would likely break the sutures Gail's stitching. Gwen was torn. She knew Tobias needed a rest, but she was certain the soldiers were going to come looking for them. I guess a few hours won't hurt, she said. I don't have any money to give you. I suppose I should have mentioned that earlier. There's no charge for kindness, Errol said. Don't worry about payment. Just take care of your friend. Thank you. After Gail had stitched Tobias's wound closed, the three of them carried him to the barn and laid him on a makeshift bed of straw. Gail covered him with a clean blanket, and Errol brought the stolen horse in, tying its reins to a post. If you decide to stay for the night, you should take the saddle off him, Errol said. Gwen nodded and sat beside Tobias. He should be fine, so long as he doesn't tear the stitches, Gail said. I know you want to be on your way, but I suggest letting him rest until morning. I'll keep that in mind, Gwen replied. The couple left her a lantern and returned to the house. Gwen watched the light cast flickering shadows along the walls. She was suddenly overcome with exhaustion. Her muscles ached and her eyes were growing heavy. She stood up and paced around the barn, trying to stay awake. Eventually, she grew tired of being on her feet and used some hay as a chair. She stared at Tobias and pondered the things he told her. If he wasn't lying, who were her real parents? Had they given her up because they didn't want her, or because they couldn't give her the life they wanted her to have? Gwen's eyes shot open, and she realized she had dozed off. She stood up and looked around, trying to determine what woke her. Tobias was in the same position, his eyes still closed. A sound outside caught her attention, and she peeked out of the barn. A group of mounted soldiers were outside the farmhouse. One of them was on foot, standing at the front door. Gwen saw Errol was talking with him. He pointed to the road, waving his hand westward. Gwen held her breath, hoping the soldiers would leave. The one on foot shouted something and struck Errol in the face, knocking the man to the ground. Gwen covered her mouth in horror, stifling a scream. She looked at the horse, then at Tobias. There was no way she could lift him onto the saddle herself. That only left one option. She would have to. Where am I? It was Tobias. Gwen rushed to his side. She put a finger to her lips and shook her head, then mouthed the words, soldiers. Tobias' face scrunched in confusion. Gwen leaned down and whispered in his ear, the soldiers are here. Tobias closed his eyes. We need to go, he rasped. I'm with you on that, but you're injured. Better injured than dead. Help me up. Gwen grabbed Tobias's hand and pulled with everything she had. A pained expression covered Tobias's face, but he only grunted softly. Gwen was impressed. She would have screamed in agony. Tobias hovered a hand over the bandage Gale had wrapped over the wound. Is this your handiwork? He asked. Hardly, Gwen answered. If I help you, can you get on the horse? I think so. Gwen retrieved the lantern and hung it on the wall near the horse, then struggled to assist Tobias into the saddle. A long moment of frustration gave way to victory, and Tobias was seated. The lantern illuminated his face, and Gwen saw a haggard and pale complexion. Tobias grabbed the reins and turned the horse toward the barn doors. Take my hand, he said. I can manage, Gwen replied. She stuck her foot in the stirrup and flung herself upward. The first 2 times she didn't get high enough to lift her leg over the horse, but the 3rd time she succeeded. The horse clopped to the doors just as they swung open. 3 soldiers were there, on foot, swords drawn. Gwen's breath caught in her throat, but Tobias kicked the horse and yelled, Yah! The soldiers scrambled out of the way as the mare burst forth from the barn. Shouts rose, and Gwen saw the mounted soldiers pursuing them. They're coming, she shouted. We can lose them in the woods, Tobias cried back. Gwen couldn't make out much detail of the landscape, but she did see tall shadows that rose from the ground and guessed they were trees. Tobias spurred the horse, and it sped across the farmland, the hair whipping Gwen's hair about wildly. She kept looking back, hoping the soldiers would give up the chase, but there was no such luck. They were still there, but they hadn't gotten any closer. They reached the woods, and Tobias turned the horse to the right, guiding it to a brook. The water moved slowly and wasn't very high. This should throw them off, Tobias said, forcing the horse into the water. They headed upstream, traveling for a long while in silence. They left the woods behind and were greeted by rolling green hills. Once the water started to get deeper, Tobias took them back on a dry land and stopped atop one of the hills to stare back the way they'd come. I think we lost them, he said, his voice little more than a whisper. Gwen wasn't certain, but she thought she saw movement down by the stream. What's that? She asked, pointing. Tobias stared for a moment, then his eyes widened. Impossible, he choked. They're still tracking us.
Chapter 6. Connell. Connell stared at the crossbow in his hands, the bolt notched and ready. Silence had smothered the forest as those surrounding him waited. He looked up to see the steward 5 paces away, cringing in abject terror, the 2 highwaymen gripping him by his arms, holding him up. His brilliant plan of extricating himself had gone painfully wrong, and he'd wondered if they knew he had never killed a man before. Not that he hadn't wanted to on more than few occasions, but wanting and actually doing were 2 vastly different affairs. Well, come on, Jock urged. We don't have all day. With a grin of false bravado, Connell shifted his gaze to him. Hardly seems sporting. How can I miss? That's the point, Jock answered. You're not supposed to miss. I know, but where's the fun of killing an unarmed man held firmly in one spot? You want to give him a chance? Jacques raised an eyebrow. Why not? An idea blossomed, along with his confidence. Give him a 5-second head start down the road. Make it interesting. Jacques sniffed a laugh. All right. Turning to his steward, he pointed down the road. You've got 5 seconds. If he misses, you live. He looked back at Connell. You ready? Ready and waiting, Connell cheerfully replied, shifting position on the road and raising the crossbow to his shoulder. With their attention focused on Connell and the steward, they didn't notice Farrell's stern wave at another highwayman, demanding the man's crossbow. Despite initial misgiving and after repeated silent demands, the man understood and handed the weapon to him. You can let go of him, Jacques commanded the two men holding the steward. Staring directly at the steward, he pointed to the road behind the terrified man. Let's see how fast you can go. Go! The steward spun around and gave panic to his legs, turning as fast as he could, hearing Jacques announce, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Connell took aim at the disappearing steward. Despite having never killed a man, he was more than proficient with the crossbow, this time aiming just to the left of the man's head. In the interval between Connell's aim and squeezing the trigger lever, Farrell stood in the stirrups, aimed and launched his bolt, hitting the steward squarely between the shoulder blades and causing him to stumble enough to the left that Connell's bolt rammed into the back of the man's head. Ouch, Jacques smirked. That's going to leave a bruise. Turning back to Connell, he complimented, nice shot, adding, and you too, to Lord Farrell. I will send a man to you to negotiate our bargain to eliminate Blaine. Connell's mouth had dropped open the moment his bolt whipped the man's head forward. Now rooted to the ground, he fumbled with his emotions. In truth, the steward meant nothing to him. Had Connell continued in Farrell's employ as a cobra, he would have had the man killed per Farrell's instructions. If someone else would have done the killing, his hands would be clean. But was there a difference, really? Still, the steward was a traitor and needed to be dealt with. Besides, it was Lord Farrell's bolt that killed the man. Connell's introspection was interrupted when Jacques circled his finger in the air and called out to the band, let's get ready to move out. Connell hustled several steps to catch up with him. What about the slaves? What about them? Manumission? Jacques shook his head. Not my problem, not my call. Though disappointed, Connell understood. Now was not the time to press the issue. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw Farrell waiting to speak with him. I am sorely disappointed I am losing your services, Farrell gravely said. Who knows where the future lies, my lord? I still proudly wear your mark. He tipped his head towards the bandaged shoulder. Farrell sat back in his saddle, peering intently at the young man before him, before loudly declaring, to all who stand here now as witness, I declare Connell to be a free man. He narrowed his gaze at Jacques. When you send your man to see me, I will give him the necessary papers. Thank you, my lord. Connell bowed and inwardly grinned. He had yet again got himself out of a mess. Gathering the reins, Farrell nodded and resumed his march. Two of his guards, having already moved the steward off the road into the forest where the carrion fowl and animals would feast upon the body. Waiting until Farrell was down the road, Jacques wryly commented, well, he gave you your freedom. I noticed he took your horse. It was his to begin with, Connell shrugged with a smile. So, what's the plan? We head on home. Walk with me. Jacques led the way into the forest, Connell dodging trees and bushes to keep up. Tell me about yourself. Where are you from? Irving. On the coast? Yes. Jacques tossed a quizzical glance at him. How did you end up in Hamlin? My father decided I needed to be educated, so he sent me to the priory, Eckersley. Not liking their method of education, I escaped when I was 15. Knocked around for a couple of years refining my inept skill of thievery, then threw in my lot with a man called Oskin. I've heard of him. Connell scowled. I hope to meet him again in better circumstances, when I can plunge a knife into the man's throat. It is because of him that I wear this brand. Jacques glanced around and then quickly surveyed the men, and women scattered around him. How is it you were branded a cobra? I'd love to say because of my formidable abilities, but honestly, I haven't a clue. Jock chuckled. You think fast and you're a thief, which is a good thing. We'll need that where we're going. I thought we were going to help Farrell, Connell said. We are, but not quite yet. I'll explain later. Accepting response for the moment, Connell asked, who are you when you're not Jock? Jock grinned, impressed once again with the young man. I'm Ronan. Connell held on to his next question when he saw them, the horses, a man and a woman guiding them. You can either ride double or walk, Ronan said. Your choice. A man emerged from a thicket and languidly walked towards Ronan. He was tall, with a full, dark brown beard, thick hair that fell below his shoulders, and coal black eyes. He dressed like a huntsman with tight, dark green leggings and calf-high leather boots, and a brown leather vest over forest green long-sleeve shirt. A supple leather bag of lambskin held by a shoulder strap bounced on his left hip as he walked. His right hand held a staff of polished oak topped with a dragon's head. As the man walked up, Colin couldn't tell if he was looking at Ronan or him, for the eyes were solid and opaque. The man stopped and swiveled his head to gaze at Connell. At least that's what it felt like. This him? The man's voice was an odd contrast to his dress, with a voice that a resonant hum of tranquility, the softness of peace. Yes, Ronan answered. Where are you from, lad? Hervé, Connell replied, a bit unnerved by the sightless eyes. Who are you? This is Drewston, Ronan answered for him, the half-druid. Which half? Connell said without thinking, causing Ronan to giggle and Drewston to stiffen. He means no harm, Ronan soothed, then turned to Connell. You would do well to curb your quick tongue on occasion. Do you not know what a half-druid is? No. Connell had heard of druids, but half-druids? A half-druid, Ronan explained, is a druid bonded with an undead soul. Sounds painful, Connell quipped. Have a care, lad, the druid snapped, straining to maintain his soothing voice. Do not mock that which you don't know or understand. Hold out your hand. Why? Connell usually didn't like someone from the start, but this guy was an exception. Do it, Connell commanded. I say again, Connell stubbornly replied. Why? Because I told you so. The half-druid's voice morphed to a brittle harshness. Just do it, please, Ronan said, carefully watching the interaction. Figuring they weren't going to let it go until he obeyed, Connell reluctantly stuck out his hand. The half-druid grasped Connell's hand and closed his eyes. Connell felt a searing pain shoot throughout his body, and he yelped as he worked to pry his hand free, but the druid's strength was far too strong. It was like Connell had gotten his hand stuck in a rock crevice, and despite his wild flailing, the rock never moved. The pain increased along with the intense heat until he felt he was going to explode and melt at the same time. The druid let go, and Connell careened backwards, tumbling onto the ground. What the hell? Connell yelled, clutching his hand. Well, Ronan looked at Druid. Ronan said, looking at Drewston. I could not see the birth mind, the half-druid answered, looking at Connell, who shook his hand, trying to pull it off. His other memories are of Hervé and a sense of despair at the separation from his father. He bent forward slightly to focus on Connell. Are you telling me the truth? I haven't said anything, Connell snarled. It nearly killed me. I know, he nodded. That's what bothers me. He brusquely turned to Ronan. He has strength far beyond a mere wharf rat. I'm not a wharf rat, Connell growled. My father is a jewelry merchant, a very successful one. So get your story straight. Drewston tilted his head to look at the bulge beneath the shirt of Connell's shoulder. You wear a brand. Shall we look at it? Why? Drewston chuckled. To see how it heals. Though curious himself, Connell didn't like the thought that this half-druid wanted to see it. Tell me, the druid said. Does it still hurt? Connell frowned in thought, realizing the pain had stopped as soon as the branding iron lifted from his arm. No, not really. Drewston nodded. Come, let us see how well it heals. Connell hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt and reached up and unwrapped the thin cloth surrounding the brand. Drewston reached out to touch it and jerked his hand back as though stung. A cobra head. He stepped back, shaking his head. This is all wrong. It doesn't fit. Doesn't fit what? Connell demanded before glancing down at the brand, not surprised that his scar had completely healed and the brand itself looking quite good. Instead of answering, the half-druid spun around and stalked off. What's with him? Connell sniffed. Ronan bent down to study Connell's brand, looked up at Connell, then swiveled his head to watch the half-druid flop down beneath an oak tree. Your scar has healed. So it seems, Connell nonchalantly replied. You were branded this morning? Yes. Ronan stood back up. Do you not find this unusual? I was always a fast healer, he shrugged. Ronan shook his head. Not this fast. You mind telling me what's going on? Ronan stared at him a moment before saying, we are searching for someone. Who? A king's son. Huh. What does that have to do with me? He put his shirt back on. You are the right age. Kyle paused to button his shirt and barked a disbelieving laugh. Me? Are you daft? My father's a jeweler. I've been a highwayman for these past several years. I've just been branded as an outlaw. What's wrong with you people? You round up my guys my age and let Grip and Grin over there roast them to see if they might be a king? What's wrong with this picture? I know it sounds strange, Ronan grinned, but there are reasons behind it. So, who is this king anyway? His name was Cameron. Was? So sometime along the way, this guy loses a kid and then dies, and now you're trying to find the kid? Kids. There's a girl too. Connell shook his head in disgust. This is the stuff of fairy tales. Next, you're going to tell me that you guys work for some evil king who wants to kill all the kids because they're the rightful heirs of the throne. When Ronan remained silent, Connell threw up his hands. I was making a joke. Please tell me you're not serious. We are, Ronan quietly replied, and you can help us. How? I don't know any royalty, let alone any king's kids. And why would I want to throw in my lot with an evil king? By definition, he's bad. We actually think something good is going to come of this? There's far more going on than I can explain, or that you would understand, Ronan said. Besides, you got something better to do? Yeah, I could learn to be a cobra. Maybe later, Ronan firmly said. For now, you're one of us. Just great. Connell fumed and stopped off to mingle with the horses, who were probably the only sane creatures around here. Ronan watched him trudge away before turning to walk over to where Drewston sat. What did you see? He is a conundrum. He has the aura of the one we search for, but he has too many inconsistencies. His birth mind is blank before nursing. That alone gives me cause to suspect. And his healing, another factor. And he endured the limits of my strength. However, he bears the cobra head. So? Drewston lifted his eyes to stare at Ronan. The eagle will bear the viper in its claws. Yet from the west, a cobra will rise and strike down the eagle. Ronan shook his head. That means nothing to me. Drewston curled a lip. The eagle is King Torian. The vipers are Cameron's children. The cobra is an unknown assassin who will claim the throne on his own. Ronan looked back over his shoulder at Connell, who was nuzzling one of the horses. Well, what do you want to do with him? We can take no chances. We must kill him.
All right. We'll be back next week with 2 more chapters. So if you like the story, hit the subscribe button and keep following the journey as we do the author reading. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.